A quiet apartment in Harlem. Wrinkled hands rest on a worn book cover. The title reads, Harlem Godfather. The Rap on My Husband. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. Mayme Johnson is 80-something now. Half a century of silence sits heavy in this room. She's watched Hollywood turn her husband into a legend, guns blazing, enemies falling, power absolute. She's watched actors play the man she loved, getting almost everything wrong. Not anymore. Hollywood made Bumpy Johnson a legend. His wife revealed the truth they didn't show. This is that truth. Mayme Johnson had kept quiet for 40 years. 40 years of watching journalists get it wrong. 40 years of biographers who never met Bumpy writing about Bumpy. 40 years of Harlem legends growing bigger, further from the man who used to burn toast in their kitchen on Sunday mornings. She could have spoken earlier. God knows, people asked. Reporters knocked on her door in 1968, right after the funeral. Notebooks ready to capture the grieving widow's tears. Documentary filmmakers called in the 80s. True crime writers in the 90s. She said no to all of them. Because grief deserves privacy. Because some stories aren't ready to be told. But then came 2008. That's when Mayme saw the TV show. Godfather of Harlem, they called it. Starring a talented actor who looked nothing like Bumpy, sounded nothing like Bumpy, moved nothing like Bumpy. She watched episode 1 with her daughter. Watched this Hollywood version of her husband shoot 3 men before the opening credits finished. She turned off the television. "Mama?" her daughter asked. Mayme sat in the dark for a long time. Then she said, "Get me a writer. A good one." That's how Karen E. Quinones Miller got the call. That's how the memoir happened. That's how, in 2008, Oshun Publishing released a book that would quietly correct decades of mythology. But let's talk about what Mayme was correcting first. Let's talk about Hollywood's Bumpy Johnson. In the TV series, Bumpy is a strategic mastermind. Every move calculated, every conversation a chess game. He walks into rooms and violence follows. He speaks in controlled whispers that make grown men tremble. He's always 3 steps ahead, always untouchable. Always, and this is important, always performing power. The show opens with his return from Alcatraz in 1963. He steps off that ferry like a king reclaiming his throne. Within 1 episode, he's orchestrating complex criminal operations, outsmarting the Italian mob, protecting Harlem through brilliant tactical violence. It's good television. Damn good television. Mayme watched it and barely recognized her husband. Hollywood does this because Hollywood needs simplification. You can't show complexity in 42 minutes between commercials. You can't show a man who is dangerous and kind, violent and gentle, criminal and community protector. You can't show contradictions. So Hollywood picks one, the dangerous one, the violent one, the one that keeps viewers on the edge of their seats. They amplify the shootouts. They add the strategic monologues. They make every interaction a power play, every relationship transactional. Why? Because violence sells. Because America loves gangster mythology. Because a complicated human being doesn't fit into the anti-hero archetype that streaming services know will get renewals. Mayme understood this. She wasn't naive about how media works. But understanding something doesn't make it hurt less when you watch actors playing scenes that never happened, saying words your husband never said, being a person he never was. So she decided, if Hollywood gets to tell their version, she gets to tell hers. The real version. The one where Bumpy Johnson was exactly as dangerous as everyone says and nothing like anyone thinks. In the TV show, Bumpy meets his wife during a dramatic moment. There's tension in the air. Maybe gunfire in the background. Maybe he's just saved someone. Maybe there's a spark of danger that makes the romance exciting. Mayme's memoir tells a different story. She met Ellsworth Mayme Johnson on a Sunday afternoon in 1948 at a church social. Not a nightclub, not a jazz joint, not during a shootout or a police raid. A church social. The kind where older ladies brought potato salad, and younger women wore their best dresses, and everyone pretended not to be sizing up potential matches. Mayme was 34. She'd been married before, briefly, unsuccessfully. She wasn't looking for a husband, certainly not a notorious one. She was looking for the dessert table. Bumpy was 43, fresh back from another stint upstate. He was standing near the punch bowl, talking quietly with Reverend Powell about something Mayme couldn't hear. She noticed him because everyone noticed him, not because he commanded the room, but because people made space for him naturally, the way you make space for someone whose presence carries weight. He noticed her noticing. That's how Mayme describes it in her memoir. He noticed me noticing. No lightning bolt. No love at first sight. Just a man seeing a woman looking at him and deciding to walk over. "You're new to this church," he said. Not a question, a statement. "You haven't been coming long either," Mayme replied. Also not a question. He smiled. Small smile. Private smile. "Reverend Powell's been trying to save my soul for 20 years. I figure I owe him attendance now and then." They talked for 30 minutes. About nothing important. About church politics and Harlem rent prices, and whether the potato salad was too mayonnaise heavy this year. Bumpy didn't mention what he did. Mayme didn't ask. Everyone in Harlem knew who Bumpy Johnson was. You didn't ask. You just knew. Before he left, he said, "I'd like to take you to dinner." Mayme said yes. That's it. That's the Hollywood-worthy first meeting. No gunfight. No dramatic rescue. No intense eye contact across a smoky room. Just a church social, potato salad, and a polite dinner invitation. Their first date was at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. Bumpy arrived on time, which surprised Mayme. She'd expected gangster unpredictability. He wore a pressed suit. He pulled out her chair. He asked about her family, her work as a domestic worker, her life before Harlem. He was, Mayme wrote, a perfect gentleman that night. She also wrote, "I knew what he was. Everyone knew. But that night, he was just a man trying to impress a woman. And he did." They dated for 6 months before he proposed. 6 months of dinners and walks through Harlem and conversations that had nothing to do with crime or violence or the life everyone knew he lived. 6 months where Bumpy Johnson, the feared enforcer, was just Ellsworth, a man who laughed at Mayme's jokes and brought her flowers on Thursdays. When he proposed, he was honest. Brutally honest. "I can't promise you safety," he said. "I can't promise you respectability. I can promise you I'll love you until I die. And I'll protect you with everything I have. But my life, it's complicated." Mayme said yes anyway. That's how the Godfather of Harlem met his wife. No drama, no Hollywood moment. Just two people choosing each other, knowing exactly what that choice meant. Hollywood skipped all of this. Too ordinary. Not cinematic enough. Mayme remembered every detail. Monday, grocery shopping at the corner market. Tuesday, hair appointment at Miss Ruby's salon. Wednesday, visiting Bumpy's lawyer to discuss the latest charges. Thursday, church, auxiliary meeting. Friday, dinner with friends. Saturday, Bumpy's poker game downstairs while Mayme read magazines upstairs. This was Mayme's life. Hollywood shows the wife of a gangster as either blissfully ignorant or dangerously complicit. She's either the naive woman who doesn't ask questions, or the Lady Macbeth figure whispering ambitions into her husband's ear. Mayme was neither. She knew exactly where the money came from. Bumpy ran numbers in Harlem, the illegal lottery that every working person played because legal opportunities didn't exist for black folks in 1,950 seconds America. He took protection money from businesses. He occasionally strong-armed rival operators. He was, by every legal definition, a criminal. Mayme knew this the way you know the sun rises in the east. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't hidden. It was simply the reality of who she married. But here's what Hollywood doesn't show. the ordinariness of it all. Most days, Bumpy wasn't orchestrating elaborate heists or engaging in shootouts. Most days, he was managing a business. An illegal business, yes, but a business nonetheless. He had meetings. He had employees. He had schedules. He came home tired. He complained about problem workers. He worried about cash flow. Mayme describes in her memoir the strange domesticity of living with Harlem's most feared man. Bumpy hated doing dishes but always did them without being asked. He couldn't cook anything except scrambled eggs, which he made every Sunday morning badly. He fell asleep on the couch during radio programs. He had a favorite chair. He read constantly, history books, philosophy, anything he could get his hands on. People expected our life to be constant danger, Mayme wrote. It was mostly constant routine. But the money. Let's talk about the money. It was dirty money. Mayme never pretended otherwise. It came from gambling, from businesses that had no choice but to pay for protection, from a system that was illegal because legal systems were closed to black entrepreneurs. But that dirty money paid rent. It bought groceries. It sent nieces and nephews to college. It kept the lights on. It provided a middle-class life that Mayme's domestic worker salary never could have afforded. Mayme wrestled with this. Her memoir doesn't shy away from the moral complexity. She went to church every Sunday and prayed for Bumpy's soul. She also deposited his money every Monday and paid bills with it. Was I complicit? She wrote in one chapter. Every wife of every criminal has to answer that question. I can't answer it for you. I can only tell you. I stayed. I loved him. I used the money, and I'm not sure I'd change it if I could. The neighborhood respected her, not feared her, respected her. Women at the salon treated her normally. Shopkeepers were kind. Children called her Mrs. Johnson and meant it politely. She wasn't the gangster's wife in Harlem. She was just Mayme, Bumpy's wife, a woman who volunteered at church functions and always had candy for kids and kept her stoop clean. Hollywood wants the wife to be dramatic, traumatized or ruthless, victim or villain. Mayme was a woman who made compromises to survive, who loved a complicated man, who lived in the strange space between respectability and crime. She was, in other words, more human than Hollywood allows women to be. Most nights, after Bumpy came home, they'd sit together in their living room. He'd read his books. She'd do her sewing. They'd talk about nothing important. That's marriage. Even when your husband is a criminal. Federal marshals came for Bumpy at 6 a.m. Mayme heard the knock, already knew what it meant. She'd heard that particular knock before official, insistent, final. Conspiracy to distribute narcotics. Federal charges this time. Federal meant serious. Federal meant Alcatraz. Mayme was 40 years old when they took her husband away for 9 years. 9 years, 3,285 days. She did the math. Then she did what she had to do. She survived. Hollywood skips this part. 9 years doesn't fit into a 2-hour movie or even a TV season, so they compress it. They show a scene of the wife visiting prison, tears rolling down her face through a glass barrier, and then they cut to his release. Time jump complete. Marriage intact. Moving on. Mayme's memoir spends 3 chapters on these 9 years. Because 9 years isn't a time jump. It's a lifetime. It's watching yourself age in the mirror while your husband ages behind bars. It's loneliness so deep, you forget what it feels like to be touched. It's stigma, the prison wife stigma, that follows you into grocery stores, church pews, job interviews. The first year was the hardest. Mayme had to figure out money. Bumpy's organization tried to take care of her. His lieutenant dropped off cash twice a month, but it wasn't the same. She didn't want to owe them. She didn't want to be dependent on men who might not stay loyal. So she went back to work, cleaning houses, Domestic work. The same work she'd done before marrying Bumpy, the work she thought she'd escaped. "Pride is expensive," she wrote. "I couldn't afford it. The visiting was worse than the loneliness." Once a month, Mayme took the train from New York to San Francisco, then the ferry to Alcatraz. The whole trip cost money she barely had. The ferry ride made her sick. Every time cold, choppy water, that rock getting closer. She'd stand at the railing and stare at America's toughest prison and think, my husband is in there. The visits were 30 minutes. 30 minutes once a month. You couldn't touch. Glass barrier between you. Guards watching, listening. You learned to say, "I love you" with your eyes because saying it out loud felt like performing for the guards. Bumpy tried to be strong for her. She tried to be strong for him. They spent most visits lying. "How are you?" she'd ask. "Good. Reading a lot. The library here is extensive," he'd say. He wasn't good. The prison broke men. It was designed to break men. But he wouldn't tell her that. Wouldn't give her that burden. She'd tell him everything was fine back home. The apartment was good. She was managing. His friends checked on her. All lies, or partial truths shaped into lies. The apartment was too big and too empty. She was barely managing. His friends checked on her too often, which felt like surveillance more than care. But you don't say these things through prison glass. The Harlem community surprised her. She expected judgment, expected whispers, expected to be treated like a criminal's wife, which she was, but she expected that to mean something bad. Instead, the neighborhood protected her. Women from church brought food. Shopkeepers gave her discounts they claimed were for regular customers. Young men from Bumpy's old crew shoveled her stoop when it snowed, fixed her plumbing when it leaked, walked her home from the train station late at night. Harlem took care of its own, Mayme wrote, even when its own included the wife of a man the law had locked away. The question everyone asked, though never to her face, was, why didn't she leave? 9 years is long enough to divorce, move on, start over. She was still young enough, still attractive enough, still capable of building a new life. Mayme addresses this directly in the memoir. "I thought about it. God knows I thought about it. But I'd made a promise, not to Bumpy, to myself. I'd chosen this man, knowing exactly who he was. I wasn't going to abandon that choice because it got hard." The day Bumpy was released, Mayme took that ferry to Alcatraz one last time. This time, he walked off with her. They'd both aged a decade and 9 years. They went home to Harlem. They never talked about Alcatraz again. The TV show gives you Bumpy Johnson, the archetype, the calculating gangster. Quiet, controlled, strategic. Every word measured, every move planned. Power radiating from him constantly. Mayme's memoir gives you Ellsworth Mayme Johnson, the human being. The man who burned toast every Sunday. The man who read philosophy and argued with himself about Plato's Republic. The man who cried exactly once in their marriage when his mother died and then never again. The man who had a terrible temper and a surprisingly gentle touch. Both versions are true. That's what Hollywood can't capture. Simultaneity. A person can be terrifying and tender, violent and thoughtful, criminal and principled. Bumpy was all of these things at once. Mayme describes his intelligence first. Not street smarts, though he had those, but actual intellectual hunger. He dropped out of school in 5th grade, but he educated himself obsessively. He read history, philosophy, political theory. He could quote Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois from memory. He had opinions on Reconstruction and the New Deal and what Roosevelt's policies meant for Black Americans. He was smarter than most college graduates I knew, Mayme wrote, and angrier than most people allowed themselves to be. That anger. Let's talk about that anger. Bumpy carried rage the way other men carried. Wallets always there, always accessible, carefully controlled until it wasn't. Rage at a system that treated black people as subhuman. Rage at police, who brutalized Harlem with impunity. Rage at Italian mobsters who tried to take over black neighborhoods. Rage at poverty, at injustice, at the grinding daily humiliation of being black in America. That rage made him dangerous. But Mayme also describes his unexpected softness. He loved children, loved them in a way that surprised everyone. Kids in the neighborhood weren't afraid of Bumpy Johnson. They ran up to him on the street. He always had candy in his pockets. He paid for school supplies, winter coats, medical bills for families who couldn't afford them. He couldn't pass a child without smiling, Mayme wrote. This man who terrified grown men turned into pudding around a 5-year-old. The contradictions were constant. He was violent. Mayme doesn't deny this. She knew he hurt people. She knew his hands had blood on them. She never asked for details, but she knew. She'd see him come home with split knuckles, with tension in his shoulders, with a darkness in his eyes that took hours to fade. But he never raised a hand to her. Not once. Not even in anger. He was a criminal who followed his own strict code. He wouldn't tolerate drugs in his territory, ironic, given his federal conviction. But Mayme insists his narcotics charge was a setup. He wouldn't allow violence against women. He wouldn't rob from black-owned businesses. He drew lines, clear lines, and enforced them brutally. He had morality, Mayme observed. It just wasn't the morality society recognized. At home, he was surprisingly ordinary. He liked routine. Dinner at 6. Radio programs in the evening. Bed by 10. He was neat, obsessively neat, and got irritated when Mayme left magazines on the coffee table. He hated small talk but loved deep conversations that lasted until midnight. He was also funny. This surprised Mayme most. The neighborhood knew Bumpy as stern, intimidating. But with her, he'd tell jokes. Dry humor, dark humor. He'd do impressions of people they knew. He'd laugh, really laugh, head thrown back at Lucy on the television. The world saw Bumpy Johnson, the gangster, Mayme concludes one chapter. I saw Ellsworth, the man. Both were real. Neither was complete without the other. Hollywood couldn't show this. Too contradictory. Too human. So they simplified him into an archetype. Mayme loved the complicated version. July 7th, 1968, 6:30 a.m. Mayme woke up alone. She'd woken up alone plenty of times in 20 years. Bumpy's business kept strange hours, but something felt different this morning. The apartment was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hold your breath. She found him in the dining room at Wells' restaurant. No, that's not accurate. Let Mayme tell it. I got the phone call at 7. Frank Lucas. His voice was wrong. You need to come to Wells, he said. Now. I knew. Before he said it. Before I left the apartment. Before I walked those 6 blocks, I knew. Bumpy had died of a heart attack in the dining room, where he ate breakfast almost every morning. Surrounded by people who knew him, respected him, feared him. He was 62 years old. The details Mayme provides in her memoir are almost clinical. She describes walking into Wells' restaurant. She describes seeing the ambulance. She describes the crowd gathered outside, neighbors already knowing something was wrong. She describes the moment a police officer tried to stop her from entering, and Frank Lucas saying, "That's his wife." She describes everything except her own feelings. Not at first. At first, the memoir reads like a police report. I entered the restaurant at approximately 7:15 a.m. I was escorted to where my husband's body was. I confirmed his identity. I was asked questions by police. I provided answers. It's not until 3 paragraphs later that Mayme writes, I didn't cry. Not there. Not with everyone watching. Not with police taking notes and neighborhood people pressing against the windows. I stood there and confirmed, yes, this is my husband. Yes, he has heart problems. Yes, I'll need his body released for burial. I was efficient. I was calm. I was a widow. Then, I didn't cry until I got home and closed the door and realized I'd never hear his key in that lock again. The next 72 hours were a blur that Mayme describes in painful detail. She had to plan a funeral. She had to notify family, his sisters, her relatives, his friends from the life he'd lived before her. She had to deal with police, who were respectful but suspicious, always suspicious. She had to field calls from journalists who wanted a, quote, a story, a glimpse into the private grief of Bumpy Johnson's widow. She also had to calculate her survival. This is the part Hollywood never shows. The immediate practical terror of widowhood in the criminal world. Bumpy protected her. Bumpy's reputation protected her. Bumpy's organization protected her. Who protects her now? Mayme spent those 3 days between death and funeral making phone calls, checking in with Bumpy's lieutenants, making sure everyone understood she wasn't a threat, wasn't trying to take over, just wanted to be left alone, making sure she'd be safe. I loved my husband, she wrote. But I wasn't naive. The life he lived was dangerous. The people he dealt with were dangerous. And a widow with knowledge is a liability. She extracted promises. From Frank Lucas, from Malcolm X's family who'd stayed close, from community leaders who respected Bumpy. She made sure everyone understood. She wanted no part of the business. She'd fade into the background. In exchange, they'd let her live in peace. This negotiation happened while she was planning her husband's funeral, while she was picking out his suit, while she was choosing hymns, while she was greeting visitors who came to the apartment to pay respects. She did this because she had to. Grief is a luxury, Mayme wrote. I couldn't afford it yet. The memoir doesn't romanticize widowhood, doesn't make Mayme noble or tragic. Instead, it shows a woman calculating her survival in real time, loving her dead husband, also protecting her living self. On the night of July 9th, 2 days after Bumpy died, Mayme sat alone in their apartment. The funeral was tomorrow. The community was preparing. Harlem was already talking about how big this funeral would be, how many people would come, how this was history. Mayme was thinking about what happens after the funeral, after the community moves on, after she's just the widow of a man who died 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, 2 years ago. She was 54 years old. Her husband was dead. Her life as Mrs. Bumpy Johnson was over. What came next? That night, she didn't know. Tomorrow, Harlem would bury its king. Tonight, Mayme was just a widow, sitting in the dark, trying to figure out how to survive. They closed the streets for him. Not officially. The city didn't declare it. The police didn't order it. But on July 10th, 1968, Harlem shut down for Bumpy Johnson's funeral. Businesses closed, hung signs that said closed for funeral. Shopkeepers pulled down grates. Even the numbers runners stopped running, which, as Mayme noted, never happened. The funeral was at Abyssinian Baptist Church, Reverend Powell's church, the same church where Mayme and Bumpy met 20 years earlier. By 9 a.m., 3 hours before the service, people were already lining up. The line stretched around the block, then 2 blocks, then 4. Thousands of people came to say goodbye to a man the law called a criminal. Mayme arrived at 11 a.m. with family. She wore black, simple, dignified. She'd been up since dawn getting ready, which mostly meant sitting at her vanity mirror and staring at her own reflection, trying to prepare herself for public grief. I didn't want to cry in front of everyone, she wrote, but I knew I would. The church was packed, every pew filled, people standing in the aisles, more people outside, couldn't fit inside, just wanted to be there. Mayme looked around and saw Harlem. She saw the criminals, men who worked with Bumpy, men who feared Bumpy, men who'd been to prison with Bumpy. She saw civil rights leaders, members of Malcolm X's family, activists who'd partnered with Bumpy when Harlem needed protecting from police brutality or mob encroachment. She saw regular people, shopkeepers, teachers, nurses, janitors, people Bumpy had helped quietly, people whose rent he'd paid, whose kids' school clothes he'd bought, whose businesses he'd protected. She also saw white faces, police detectives, federal agents, journalists. They stood in the back, taking notes, watching to see who attended a gangster's funeral. The Amsterdam News would later describe the scene as unprecedented. The New York Times would call it surprising. Both newspapers noted the same thing. This wasn't how criminals get buried. This was how community leaders get buried. Reverend Powell eulogized Bumpy carefully. He acknowledged the life Bumpy lived, didn't pretend Bumpy was a saint. But he also spoke of Bumpy's protection of Harlem, his generosity, his intelligence, his complex relationship with a society that offered black men limited choices. "We do not condone the life he lived," Powell said, "but we understand why he lived it." Mayme sat in the front row, flanked by family. She cried quietly through the whole service, not dramatic crying, just tears that wouldn't stop, sliding down her face while she stared at the closed casket. After the service, there was a viewing. Thousands filed past. Mayme stood for hours, shaking hands, accepting condolences, hearing the same phrases. "He was a good man. He helped my family. I'm so sorry for your loss." One woman, elderly, grabbed Mayme's hands and said, "He saved my store. The mob was going to burn it. Bumpy stopped them. I never got to thank him." One young man, maybe 20, "Bumpy paid for my college. I wouldn't have graduated without him." One mother with 3 children, "He made sure my kids had coats every winter." Story after story, person after person. The newspapers would report that Bumpy Johnson's funeral drew thousands of mourners. They'd speculate about why a criminal received such a send-off. They'd quote police sources saying it showed how crime had infiltrated the community. Mayme knew better. These people weren't mourning a criminal. They were mourning the man who, in a system that failed them, found ways to survive and help others survive. That's who they buried that day, Mayme wrote. Not a gangster, a protector. Complicated, flawed, criminal, yes, but also theirs. Harlem buried Bumpy Johnson and mourned the loss of protection they weren't sure they'd have again. After the funeral, Harlem moved on. The way communities always move on. There are other funerals, other tragedies, other stories. Life doesn't stop because one man dies, even if that man was Bumpy Johnson. Mayme moved on, too. Had to. She kept the apartment, the one she and Bumpy had shared for 20 years. She kept working domestic work, the same work she'd done before and during their marriage. She kept going to church every Sunday. She kept her head down, kept living. The years passed. 1,970 seconds. Harlem changed. Drugs flooded in heroin. Cocaine in ways Bumpy never would have allowed. The community Bumpy protected started deteriorating. Mayme watched it happen from her window. 1,980 seconds. People started writing books about Bumpy, getting details wrong, calling him things he wasn't, making him more violent, more powerful, more mythological. Mayme read these books, never corrected them publicly. Let the myths grow. 1,990 seconds. Documentary filmmakers called. Could they interview her? No. Biographers wrote letters. Would she provide insight? No. Crime historians knocked on her door. She closed it politely. She stayed silent for 40 years. Why? "I didn't owe anyone my story," Mayme wrote. "Bumpy was mine. Our marriage was mine. Let them speculate. Let them write their books. They weren't there. I was. But silence has limits. 2000s. The mythology got worse. Movies. TV shows. Bumpy Johnson became a character, not a person. Mayme watched actors play her husband. Watched Hollywood invent scenes that never happened. Watched them get his personality wrong, his motivations wrong, his essence wrong. She watched them erase her almost entirely. In most adaptations, Bumpy's wife is a minor character. A few scenes, some worried looks, maybe a line or two about being scared or being loyal. She exists to support the male protagonist's journey. Mayme watched this and realized, if she didn't speak now, Hollywood's version would become the only version. Future generations would know Bumpy Johnson the myth. Nobody would know Ellsworth the man. That's when she made the call to Karen E. Quinones Miller. I need to tell my story, Mayme said. The real story. Before I die, and it's lost forever. Writing the memoir took 2 years. Mayme was in her 80s by then, but her memory was sharp. She remembered everything. The first meeting at church, the domestic routines, the Alcatraz years, the funeral, everything. More importantly, she remembered who Bumpy was when cameras weren't rolling, when police weren't watching, when the neighborhood wasn't paying attention. She remembered the man. Karen E. Quinones Miller did the writing, but the voice was all Mayme's. They'd sit in that same Harlem apartment, and Mayme would talk. For hours, days, months, pulling out 40 years of stored memories. I need people to know he was human, Mayme told Karen during one session. Not a saint, not a demon. Human. 2008. Oshun Publishing released Harlem Godfather. The Rap on My Husband. Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson. The book didn't become a bestseller, didn't get major media attention. Most people who watched Godfather of Harlem probably never read it. But it existed. That was enough for Mayme. She'd set the record straight. She'd told the truth, her truth, the wife's truth. She'd given Bumpy his humanity back. In the memoir's introduction, Mayme wrote, "This is my gift to Ellsworth, the truth. Not the legend, not the myth. The man I loved, with all his complications and contradictions. The man who was exactly as dangerous as everyone says, and nothing like anyone thinks." She'd kept silent for 40 years. When she finally spoke, she said everything. Let's get specific. Let's lay out exactly what Hollywood said versus what Mayme said. Contradiction has sown. The violence level. Hollywood version. Bumpy Johnson was constantly violent. Shootouts, beatings, murders. The TV show barely goes an episode without Bumpy killing or ordering someone killed. Mayme's version. Bumpy was violent when necessary, but strategic about it. He didn't enjoy violence, she wrote. He used it like a tool, carefully, specifically. She describes a man who preferred negotiation to confrontation, who understood that reputation could do more work than actual violence. Yes, he hurt people. Yes, he killed, though Mayme never got specifics and didn't want them. But not with the frequency or casual brutality Hollywood depicts. The truth. Both versions exist in the same man. He was capable of extreme violence. He also went months without physical confrontation. Hollywood compresses 20 years into dramatic episodes, so violence becomes constant. Reality spreads that violence across decades. Contradiction #2. The strategic mastermind. Hollywood version. Bumpy was always calculating. 3 steps ahead. Every word planned. Chess master, criminal genius. Mayme's version. Bumpy was smart, but also impulsive. Hot-tempered. Made emotional decisions that hurt him strategically. He'd plan brilliantly for weeks, Mayme wrote, then ruin it all in one angry moment. She describes a man who struggled with his own temper, who made mistakes, who sometimes let pride override strategy. The truth. Intelligence and emotion aren't mutually exclusive. Bumpy could be brilliant and reckless, strategic and impulsive. Hollywood needs him to always be in control because that's what makes good TV. Reality is messier. Contradiction. #3. The relationship with community. Hollywood version. Bumpy protected Harlem because it served his criminal interests. He needed the community on his side for business purposes. Mayme's version. Bumpy protected Harlem because he loved Harlem. It wasn't strategy. Mayme insists it was home. She describes a man deeply connected to his community, knew people's names, their families, their struggles. The truth. Motives are complex. Did protecting Harlem help Bumpy's criminal enterprise? Yes. Did he also genuinely care about his community? Also yes. Hollywood forces either or. Reality allows both and. Contradiction #4. The marriage. Hollywood version. Mayme was either the suffering wife or the supportive accessory. Marginal to Bumpy's story. Mayme's version. She was a full person, partner, not prop. Made her own decisions. Stayed not out of fear or codependency, but out of complicated love and practical calculation. I chose this life every day, she wrote. Nobody made me stay. I stayed because leaving would have meant giving up who I was. The truth. Women married to criminals have agency. They're not just victims or villains. They're people making impossible choices in impossible situations. Contradiction #5. The education and intelligence. Hollywood version. Bumpy was street smart, cunning, no formal education, so his intelligence manifested as criminal genius. Mayme's version. Bumpy was intellectually voracious, self-educated through obsessive reading. He could discuss philosophy, history, politics at a level most college professors couldn't match. Mayme wrote. His intelligence wasn't just street smarts, it was genuine intellectual depth. The truth. The criminal, intellectual dichotomy is false. Bumpy was both. Hollywood struggles with this because it complicates the gangster archetype. Contradiction. #6. The relationship with violence. Hollywood version. Bumpy wielded violence comfortably. No hesitation, no guilt. Mayme's version. Violence haunted him. He'd come home after certain incidents. Mayme wrote carefully, and I could see it in his eyes. Weight, guilt. He carried those deaths. She describes a man who rationalized his violence as necessary but wasn't unaffected by it. The truth. You can be good at something and still be troubled by it. Bumpy was effective at violence. That doesn't mean it came easily or guilt-free. The larger pattern. What Hollywood does, what it always does, is simplify. Remove contradictions. Create coherent characters who make narrative sense. What Mayme does is complicate. Restore contradictions. Present a human being who doesn't make narrative sense, because real people never do. Everyone wants to know. Was Bumpy good or bad? Mayme asks at the end of one chapter. He was both. He was neither. He was a man shaped by a system that gave him limited choices, and he made the choices he made. Judge him if you want. I loved him anyway. That's the memoir's power. It refuses to let Bumpy Johnson be simple. Mayme Johnson closes the book. Literally, the memoir is finished. She sits in that same Harlem apartment, 80-something years old now. 50 years since Bumpy proposed. 40 years since he died. 2 years since she decided to finally speak. The book sits on her coffee table. Small book. Quiet book. Won't change Hollywood. Won't stop the TV shows or the movies or the mythologizing. But it exists. That's enough. In the memoir's final chapter, Mayme writes, I don't expect to change anyone's mind about Bumpy. People have decided who he was, villain or hero, criminal or protector. They've chosen their narrative. But I needed to put the truth on record. Not my opinion, not my defense, just the facts of what I saw, what I lived, what I knew. Hollywood can make their shows. Biographers can write their books. Everyone gets to tell their version. This is mine. That's what the memoir accomplishes. It doesn't defeat Hollywood's version. Can't defeat it. Hollywood has too much power. But it stands beside it, offers an alternative, says, here's what the wife saw. Here's what actually happened. Here's the man beneath the myth. Will people read it? Some. Will it change the dominant narrative? Probably not. Does it matter anyway? Yes, because primary sources matter, because witnesses matter, because the people who were actually there, who lived the story, not just reported on it or dramatized it, their accounts matter even when they're quieter than the myths. Mayme kept Bumpy human. In a culture that wants to turn black criminals into either monsters or heroes, she insisted he was a man, complicated, contradictory, capable of violence and tenderness, crime and care, brutality and love. She didn't excuse him, didn't apologize for him, but she also didn't let Hollywood simplify him. That's the memoir's gift, not just to Bumpy's legacy, but to how we understand crime, poverty, survival, and the impossible choices people make in systems designed to destroy them. If you want to understand Bumpy Johnson, Mayme writes in her conclusion, you have to understand Harlem in the 1,940 seconds, 50 seconds, 60 seconds. You have to understand what it meant to be black and ambitious in America when all legal paths to success were blocked. You have to understand that crime wasn't just crime, it was economics, politics, survival. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. And Bumpy was human. The memoir ends with a simple scene. Mayme, alone in the apartment, looking at an old photograph of Bumpy. Not Bumpy the gangster. Not Bumpy in a sharp suit looking intimidating. Just Bumpy laughing, casual, unguarded, human. This is who I remember, she writes. This is who I loved. This is who Hollywood never shows. But he was real, and I was there. Mayme Johnson passed away in 2009, 1 year after her memoir was published. She was 84 years old. She spent 40 years protecting Bumpy's story through silence. She spent her final years protecting it through truth. The memoir remains in print, quiet, steady, available for anyone who wants the wife's version, the real version, the complicated version. Hollywood still simplifies, but Mayme's book still exists, and in it, Bumpy Johnson is still human.